Before cities lit the sky with neon, before bullet trains stitched the islands of Japan together, there was a different rhythm to life, measured not in minutes but in seasons, in footsteps across damp earth, in the hush of evening fires. In this journey, we return to that older Japan, but not to the noble swordsmen of legend or the painted courtesans of storybooks, not at first. Tonight, we begin where most lives began, beneath the foot of power, beneath armor, beneath the scroll, beneath ceremony. We begin with those who lived quietly, anonymously, and often in hardship. Because history is not only written in palaces and on battlefields, it's also carried on shoulders stooped in rice fields, under skies heavy with expectation. In 4 parts, we will explore this layered past, the silent toll of peasant life under the watchful eye of a samurai, the strange, singular life of a wandering sword master, the dark, buried truths revealed in ancient grave mounds, and finally, the gentle, rigid rituals of a court where elegance masked the weight of hierarchy. So settle in. We will not rush. The story, like the old seasons, unfolds slowly. They rose before the sun, not because of choice or ambition, but because the rhythm of life demanded it. The rooster's call wasn't needed. The body already knew when the morning mist settled across the valley and the silence outside changed its tone. In small wooden houses that barely held the warmth from the communal hearth, families stirred and began another day beneath the ever-present gaze of their daimyo. The walls were thin, the bedding rough, and privacy a forgotten luxury. The air inside smelled of smoke, old rice straw, and the faint earthiness that never truly left the floor. Outside, a light wind moved through the trees, brushing against the thatched rooftops and rippling through the tall grass that lined the edges of the fields. The rice paddies were both the source of life and the unyielding burden. Shallow plots flooded with ankle-deep water reflected the sky, but the illusion of beauty ended as soon as a foot sank into the mud. The soil gripped with a wet stubbornness that made each step a labor of its own. The planting season demanded precision. Each seedling pushed into the waterlogged ground at the correct angle, spaced just so. A mistake meant less yield. Less yield meant falling short of the quota. Falling short of the quota meant punishment. That fear was always present, sitting heavily on every pair of shoulders that bent over the fields. Children worked alongside their parents, not in some ceremonial act of learning, but out of necessity. A 5-year-old might already know how to scatter straw for drying, or how to carry bundles of sticks tied with rope over their back. The hands of young boys and girls quickly grew calloused. Schooling was rare and seen as a luxury. The village might have a monk who could teach writing, but few peasant families could afford to send their children. Learning kanji would not keep a family fed. Instead, they learned by watching, how to tie a bundle, when to irrigate, how to mend a leaking roof with reed, when to light a fire, and when to conserve fuel.
Meals were modest, made from what was left after taxes. Rice was ironically uncommon on a peasant's table. Much of it was claimed by the daimyo, leaving the family with barley, millet, and root vegetables. Daikon radish, fermented pickles, and miso soup made from scraps formed the basis of a daily diet. Occasionally, if luck allowed, There might be a small fish caught from the river or dried seaweed from a merchant's visit. Hunger was a regular guest. In lean years, people learned which grasses and wild roots were edible. They didn't ask for variety, only for enough. Taxation was not merely financial, it was physical. Men from the domain office would arrive at the end of harvest, sometimes with scribes, sometimes with soldiers. The rice was measured, the amount due taken, and objections were not entertained. If a household had suffered drought, pestilence, or illness, it made no difference. The expected amount remained the same. To fall short was to risk punishment, which could include beatings, forced labor, or, in extreme cases, the seizure of one's land. The threat was often more than enough. Villages kept each other in check, knowing that rebellion by one might bring collective suffering. The labor was not confined to planting and harvest. In winter, when the paddies froze or dried up, there was firewood to gather, tools to mend, roofs to patch, and roads to maintain. The domain might issue sudden orders requiring villagers to help construct a wall or clear a forest path. Refusal was unwise. Time was not a personal possession. It belonged to the land, to the family, to the daimyo. Even festivals, when they came, were double-edged. While they brought music and food and a rare sense of shared joy, they also meant extra work in preparation and cleanup. Illnesses, once they arrived, spread quietly but swiftly. With no real access to doctors, peasants relied on herbal remedies and prayer. A sore throat could become something much worse. Childbirth was perilous. Injuries from tools or accidents often led to infection. The nearest healer might be a half-day's walk, and even then, his treatments might be based more on tradition than effectiveness. Superstition blended with medicine. Charms were tied above doorways. Some carried small talismans sewn into their sleeves. And yet, death remained close, quiet, and almost always expected.
The samurai, though often romanticized, were a source of fear to the farming class. A mounted warrior riding through a village could command obedience with a glance. A perceived insult might result in punishment, sudden, unquestioned, and absolute. The sword was not just a symbol of honor, it was the instrument of unchecked power. Some samurai were just, but many were not. Peasants learned to bow low, speak softly, and avoid being noticed. Justice was not symmetrical. If a farmer wronged a samurai, it was treason. If a samurai wronged a farmer, it was discipline. Family names and identities were often tied to the land. A person's entire existence might be circumscribed by a few hills, a bend in the river, a shrine nestled into a tree line. Stories were passed down not through books, but through evening conversations by the fire. Grandparents told tales of floods, of harsh lords, of years when the sun didn't come and the rice turned black. These stories weren't lessons or warnings. They were quiet records of endurance. Survival was the thread that connected generations. Despite everything, the villages endured. The rhythm of planting and harvesting continued. Children grew, married, aged, and became the elders who repeated the same cycles. The seasons changed, and with them the sky, the wind, the scent of the fields. There were no grand monuments, no paintings, no songs sung in their honor. But their lives, repetitive, laborious, often silent, formed the quiet backbone of a civilization that prided itself on order. And in the stillness of their routines, there was a kind of strength that no sword could command and no title could bestow.
The rice fields stretched across the flat lands like an endless promise. But to those who worked them, they offered little beyond exhaustion. For the samurai peasant, known as the hyakusho, life was measured in stalks and sweat. Rice was the engine of the economy, the core of tribute, the physical representation of loyalty. But while it grew tall in the fields, it rarely found its way into the bowls of those who tilled the soil. By the 17th century, Japan had entered the Tokugawa era, a time of relative peace under centralized military rule. But for peasants, peace did not bring prosperity. On the contrary, the long years of internal war that had plagued earlier centuries were replaced by a rigid and unforgiving tax system. The daimyo, powerful land-holding lords, were expected to send regular tributes of rice to the shogunate in Edo. To fulfill these quotas, they squeezed the villages under their control with relentless precision. Each spring, village officials, often samurai themselves, would arrive to measure the expected yield of each household. This process, known as nengu assessment, was deceptively simple. They walked the fields, calculated harvest potential based on past seasons and weather patterns, and set the rice tax accordingly. But they often overestimated yields, either from incompetence or under pressure to meet the daimyo's obligations. For the peasant, it meant handing over rice before ensuring their own survival for the year. These taxes were paid not in money, but in kind. Bundles of polished white rice, measured by weight and quality. Once the tax was delivered, a family would be left with only coarse grains, broken kernels, or barley for themselves. Many relied on millet, turnips, or thin gruel for daily sustenance. During bad years, of which there were many, rice reserves would vanish entirely, and households faced the cruel arithmetic of survival. Hunger was not episodic, it was constant, and it shaped every aspect of village life. Children were often malnourished. Stunted growth and wasting illnesses were common. Tooth decay and scurvy, caused by a lack of protein and fresh vegetables, haunted even the healthiest adults. And all of it was accepted, normalized, part of the rhythm of existence. The village was not a place of rebellion or choice. It was a system of obligation, inherited across generations. To make matters worse, the shogunate's policies on land inheritance meant that land farm was increasingly subdivided among heirs, shrinking each family's holdings. As plots became smaller, yields declined, yet tax expectations remained fixed or even increased. The pressure pushed peasants to cultivate even the marginal lands, hillsides, forest edges, areas prone to flooding. These were difficult to work and easily lost to storms, but desperation outweighed caution. Occasionally, peasants would withhold rice or misreport harvests, hoping to scrape by with a few extra sacks for their children. But village headmen were tasked with ensuring full compliance, and suspicion could lead to swift punishment. Fines were levied, tools confiscated, and in more serious cases,
the entire village could be held responsible for one household's shortfall, a brutal application of collective punishment known as renzai. In such an environment, social pressure replaced violence as the enforcer of order. To resist was not only to challenge the samurai, but to betray one's neighbors.
When natural disasters struck, floods, earthquakes, locusts, the system revealed its indifference. Tax demands rarely changed, regardless of famine conditions. Shogunate bureaucrats operated on schedule, not on mercy. There are records of villages reduced to near starvation, submitting their full rice tribute while surviving on tree bark, wild grasses, and boiled straw. In the coldest winters, some villagers abandoned their homes entirely, taking to the roads as kushi, itinerants with no fixed dwelling, hunted by officials and reviled by settled communities. Yet through all this, open revolt remained rare. Cultural norms of obedience, Confucian hierarchy, and fear of reprisal ensured a kind of grim compliance. When uprisings did occur, they were often small, spontaneous, and quickly crushed. It was not until centuries later, in the final days of the Tokugawa regime, that widespread peasant unrest would shake the system. But for most of the early modern period, the samurai peasants endured their burdens in silence, their loyalty measured not in spirit, but in sacks of rice. In the end, the crushing rice taxes of Tokugawa Japan were more than an economic burden. They were a system of control, a slow, grinding mechanism that kept millions pinned beneath the weight of obedience. They worked the land, harvested the grain, and watched it disappear into someone else's storehouse. Their reward? A bowl of barley porridge, a cold floor, and the hope that next year's weather might be kind.
Among the many burdens placed on the shoulders of Japan's samurai peasants during the Tokugawa era, none loomed quite so heavily as the threat of punishment, not for rebellion, not for theft, but for minor infractions, the sort that, in a more forgiving system, might warrant a scolding or perhaps a small fine. In the rigid social hierarchy of early modern Japan, however, even slight deviations from expected behavior could provoke reactions that were out of proportion, harsh, and dehumanizing. And in a village where everything was recorded, watched, and judged, those small deviations were nearly impossible to hide. The laws of the Tokugawa shogunate, codified in edicts like the Buke Shohato and the Kujikata Osada Megaki, filtered downward through layers of samurai administrators until they reached the village level. There, the rules were adapted into local codes. These rules, often posted or read aloud during village assemblies, were remarkably detailed. They specified everything from farming schedules to acceptable hairstyles. They dictated when a peasant could travel, how much silk one could wear, and even how high a fence might be built around a home. In many places, peasants were forbidden from owning watches, umbrellas, or sandals made with certain materials, objects deemed too luxurious for their station. Violating these restrictions did not result in dialogue. It did not produce negotiation. It invited punishment. A man caught wearing clothing above his rank might be forced to remove it in public and wear a rough sackcloth tunic for days. A woman accused of gossip could be paraded through the village with a board hung around her neck, inscribed with her offense. In some provinces, those who failed to bow properly to samurai officials were beaten on the spot. And all of this was considered light discipline, meant not to destroy, but to instruct
more severe penalties awaited those who offended against the structure of taxation or duty. A peasant who attempted to conceal part of his rice harvest could face public flogging, shackling, or the confiscation of property. These punishments were administered by village headmen, often with the assistance of low-ranking samurai or yoriki officers, and carried out in central areas where others could witness the consequences. The public nature of these acts served not only as correction for the offender, but as a warning to every passerby. Obedience was the price of survival. Of particular cruelty were the punishments designed to humiliate rather than injure. Some villages imposed collective penalties on entire families or groups. If one member failed in their duty, all might be forced to perform labor at night, dig trenches in silence, or spend hours kneeling in the cold as a sign of remorse. This blurred the line between individual and communal responsibility, binding every person to the discipline of the group. It was also common for transgressors to be subjected to temporary banishment. While this might sound less severe than physical pain, exile was deeply feared. A man sent away from his land could not provide for his family, and he returned with a stained reputation. If the punishment was extended to permanent expulsion, the individual would become a mibojin, an unregistered person, effectively erased from the village ledger. Without legal status, such people were denied food, shelter, or protection. They wandered roads, begging or dying quietly in ditches, their identities dissolved by a system that required record-keeping above all. Children were not spared the reach of these rules. If a boy disrespected an elder or a girl neglected her assigned duties, the consequences could involve ritual apology, public confession, or restricted meals for weeks at a time. Teachers in temple schools enforced silence and discipline with long rods, often striking without warning. These methods were considered necessary to instill virtue, to shape loyalty to family and feudal order.
And yet, despite the harshness, rebellion was rare. There were few avenues for appeal. Samurai administrators saw complaints as threats to hierarchy. Even if a punishment seemed unjust, to protest was to risk escalation. The act of writing a petition, a negai-jo, was a last resort, and if rejected, it often worsened the peasant's standing in the eyes of both lord and community. The system functioned not because it was fair, but because it enforced predictability, even in cruelty. In rare cases, however, tensions did erupt into violence. Some villages saw uprisings, or ikki, in which peasants stormed administrative offices or destroyed tax records. These rebellions were brutally suppressed. Participants were executed, often in symbolic ways: beheadings at dawn, crucifixions in public squares, or forced suicides beneath banners inscribed with their crimes. But more often, resistance was quiet, a delayed harvest report, a field left fallow in silent protest, a whispered rumor about a corrupt headman. These were acts of desperation, not of hope. What made the punishments so exhausting was not only their severity, but their constancy. A peasant's life was not punctuated by dramatic events. It was regulated by the fear of error. Every act, from when to plant to how to bow, carried the weight of surveillance and consequence. Discipline, in this context, was not a tool to correct wrongdoing. It was a form of control, a means to remind the lowest classes that their status was both visible and fragile. As the years passed and generations came and went, these punishments became part of the cultural fabric. They were spoken of quietly, woven into bedtime warnings and seasonal prayers. Children were taught that the world outside the village was colder, harsher, more dangerous.
And so they remained, working the fields, lowering their heads, navigating the invisible minefield of obedience. In a society built on layers of silence, the loudest message came from the constant, unspoken threat of retribution.
For the peasants who toiled beneath the weight of rice quotas and village expectations, there was a constant shadow that shaped their behavior, distant but never truly out of reach. It wasn't the emperor or even the shogun who imposed the greatest fear. It was the samurai. Although idealized in legend as noble warriors of discipline and honor, the samurai class in Tokugawa, Japan, was a deeply complex institution. At its highest ranks, it did indeed produce scholars, administrators, and men of measured restraint. But at the local level, especially in rural areas, many lower-ranking samurai had little to occupy their time, except enforcing the social order on those beneath them. To be a peasant under the gaze of such a man was to live in anticipation of violence that needed no justification. The Kiri Sute Gomen law, a now infamous privilege, allowed samurai to kill commoners on the spot for perceived insults or acts of disrespect. The justification had to be reported after the fact, and the samurai was supposed to act with reason and restraint, but what constituted an insult was left dangerously vague. A peasant who failed to bow low enough, who didn't clear the path quickly, or who dared to meet the eyes of a mounted samurai could be accused of impertinence. It is important to note that not all samurai abused this power. Many did not. But the peasants had no way to tell which samurai might act and which might restrain themselves. It created an environment of quiet dread. In some provinces, stories spread of villagers cut down in the road for speaking too loudly, for laughing while carrying water, or for wearing garments that rustled too brightly in the wind. Even if these stories were exaggerated, they shaped behavior. Peasants learned to avoid attention. When a samurai approached, heads were bowed, knees bent, voices hushed. Mothers trained their children in silence and posture. Fathers modeled subservience with deliberate care. Entire families could be ruined by a single misstep. And once violence had occurred, there was little recourse. The samurai might be questioned, but rarely punished. His word outweighed any number of peasant witnesses. Justice in this context was measured by rank, not by truth. The presence of violence was not constant, but its threat was. Most samurai did not ride through villages brandishing blades. Instead, they attended inspections, tax collections, and official rituals. But even these mundane appearances carried danger. If a tax inspector believed a harvest had been underreported, if a village elder's manners were found lacking, punishment could be swift. Beatings, forced confessions, and public displays of humiliation were sometimes carried out in full view of the community, as much for demonstration as for discipline. It also mattered who one offended. A minor official might grumble and move on, but a samurai with something to prove, one whose stipend had been cut or whose prestige was fading, might seize the moment to reassert his authority. There are records from domain archives of samurai administrators punishing entire households for accidental slights, a misplaced letter, a gift of rice deemed too small, a delay in offering ceremonial greetings. These were not capital crimes, but in a society built on rigid protocol, they were treated as breaches of order. And order had to be maintained at all costs. For those peasants who lived near border zones where rival lords' domains net, the threat of violence could come not only from their own samurai class, but from passing soldiers. During times of famine or regional unrest, bandits and ronin
Masterless samurai traveled the countryside. Though officially outlawed, they often moved with impunity. They extorted food, demanded shelter, and occasionally took what they wanted by force. The government condemned them, but many villages were too small, too remote, or too afraid to report such incidents. And so the peasants remained quiet, always quiet. Even within a village, samurai presence was not purely external. In some areas, low-ranking retainers or retired warriors lived among the peasants, drawing small stipends or managing storehouses. Though not always aggressive, their status allowed them to wield authority disproportionate to their function. A harsh word from such a man could mean days of additional labor, or worse, being marked as unruly in the official registry, a stain that could impact a family for generations.
Despite all this, there was rarely open resistance. The structure of Tokugawa Japan was built not merely on fear, but on deep cultural reinforcement of hierarchy. Religious teachings, Confucian ethics, and social norms combined to create a system in which obedience was not only expected, it was seen as virtuous. Peasants who suffered did not always blame the samurai. Instead, they blamed themselves, or fate, or karmic misalignment. In this way, the system preserved itself. And yet, the threat lingered. Every day. A peasant could go months, even years without incident. But the memory of a neighbor punished, of a brother-in-law struck down for insolence, remained vivid. It became part of the background noise of life, like the wind through the rice or the slow creak of a worn gate. The fear did not shout, it whispered. In rare cases, a samurai's violence would cross the line, and the village would collectively petition for justice. But these cases were exceptional, and the outcomes uncertain. More often, villagers mourned in silence, rebuilt what was lost, and reminded their children to keep their eyes lowered. Not because they were cowardly, but because they understood the cost of drawing attention. The Tokugawa peace lasted over 2 centuries, a time of relative stability. But beneath that calm exterior, millions of peasants lived with the knowledge that a single misstep, accidental, unnoticed, or misinterpreted, could unleash a force that neither apology nor intention could stop. That constant, quiet threat shaped them more than any tax or famine ever could.
Miyamoto Musashi's legacy has been immortalized through books, films, and countless retellings, but the earliest years of his life remain cloaked in equal parts fact and legend. What we do know is that he was born in the late 16th century, likely around 1584, during a time of intense military upheaval in Japan. This was the twilight of the Sengoku period, a time when daimyo warlords fought for dominance and swords were not symbols but instruments of survival. Musashi was born to a samurai family, although his exact lineage remains debated. His father, possibly a swordsman himself, either died or left when Musashi was still a child. Raised in the harsh and often isolated environment of the Japanese countryside, Musashi grew up with minimal formal education, but with access to a blade. And it was the blade, not the brush, that would shape his future. By the age of 13, Musashi had already fought his first duel. The opponent was an adult samurai named Arima Kihei, a practitioner of the Shinto Ryu school of swordsmanship. Accounts suggest that the young Musashi, unrefined and rough in demeanor, challenged Kihei publicly. Despite his youth, he wielded a wooden sword and struck down the older man with relentless aggression. Some said it was brutality, others said it was raw talent. That first duel set the tone for the years that followed. Unlike other young men who would seek formal training and a place under a lord's banner, Musashi chose the path of a ronin, a masterless wanderer. He drifted from province to province, not in search of stability, but of challenge. Each duel he sought out was another opportunity to refine his style, to learn, to dominate. It's said he fought more than 60 official duels and was never defeated. But these were not the polished, ceremonial exchanges one might associate with aristocratic swordplay. Many were brutal, unrestrained encounters. Musashi often arrived late to duels, catching opponents off guard and mentally destabilized. He sometimes used oversized wooden swords rather than steel, breaking bones rather than spilling blood. His tactics were unorthodox, designed not for fairness but for survival. At a time when honor defined much of samurai culture, Musashi stood apart. He did not follow the rituals of his peers. He refused to bathe in formality. He wore his hair disheveled, his clothing simple. Some mistook him for a madman or a vagabond. But beneath that exterior was a calculating mind, one who understood that fear, confusion, and psychological advantage were as effective as steel. Musashi's wanderings took him through villages and castles, across rivers and mountain passes. He challenged members of famous sword schools and local champions alike. Some refused to fight him after hearing of his tactics. Others accepted and did not return. The world he moved through was still unstable, shaped by the echoes of recent civil wars and the consolidation of Tokugawa rule. Yet Musashi cared little for politics. He was not interested in court favor or official titles. One of the key aspects that separated him from other swordsmen was his developing philosophy. Even during these early years, he began to understand that swordsmanship was more than technique. It was a way of seeing the world. Every duel, every opponent, every near-death moment added layers to his perspective. Later in life, these ideas would crystallize into his famous text, The Book of Five Rings. But here, in his youth, they were raw instincts forged in motion and danger.
The early 1600s were also a time of transition in Japan. The Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 had effectively ended the Sengoku chaos and ushered in Tokugawa Ieyasu's rule. Peace, stability, and bureaucracy began to replace warfare and chaos. For many warriors, this meant a shift from battlefield to bureaucratic role. But Musashi did not fit neatly into this new order. He rejected appointments and declined service under lords, even when it would have offered wealth or status. It's said he rarely slept in the same place twice. He stayed in roadside inns, forest huts, and temple courtyards. His possessions were few, his needs minimal. And yet, wherever he went, the name Miyamoto Musashi spread ahead of him like a whisper. Some wanted to challenge him, others feared him. A few admired him, even as they could not understand him. There is something curiously solitary about Musashi's youth, not merely in physical isolation, but in spirit. He had no fixed teacher, no traveling companion, no disciples. He fought not for honor,
nor vengeance nor duty, but because the act of fighting seemed to reveal something to him. It was not destruction he sought, but refinement. And yet the road he walked was littered with broken bones and bruised egos. Eventually, his duels became more selective. He no longer challenged every swordsman he met. Perhaps age softened his appetite for conflict, or perhaps, having tested himself repeatedly, he began to turn inward. But those early years, marked by duels, wandering, and defiance, became the crucible in which his philosophy was forged. In the next subsegment, we'll look more closely at the most famous duel of his life, his confrontation with Sasaki Kojiro, a moment that would define his legacy in both history and folklore.
By the year 1612, Musashi's name was already circulating across Japan. Tales of his unconventional tactics and relentless victories had reached even the distant provinces. He had long since shed the appearance of a wild youth and entered early middle age, yet his reputation had only grown. It was around this time that he encountered the man who would become his most iconic rival, Sasaki Kojiro. Sasaki Kojiro was not some hot-headed braggart or local champion. He was a swordsman of refined technique and calculated poise. Trained in the Ganryu style, Kojiro was elegant, deliberate, and feared for his skill. His signature technique was the Tsubame Gaeshi, the swallow counter, a move inspired by the flight pattern of the bird, said to be nearly impossible to defend against. If Musashi was raw strength and psychological manipulation, Kojiro was precision and composure. The two agreed to meet for a formal duel on Ganryu Island, a small wind-swept patch of land off the coast of what is now Shimonoseki. It was to be a contest not just of swordsmanship, but of two philosophies, force and flow, unpredictability versus form. Musashi's behavior leading up to the duel was, by many accounts, deliberately calculated to unsettle his opponent. He arrived late to the island, long after Kojiro and the witnesses had gathered. This wasn't the first time he had employed tardiness as a tactic. By forcing his opponent to wait in the sun, fending off rising tension and perhaps embarrassment, Musashi undermined the controlled rhythm Kojiro preferred.
When Musashi did finally arrive, he came not with a steel katana, but with a wooden sword, carved from an oar aboard the boat that had ferried him to the island. The weapon was longer than a typical sword, and rough in appearance. To onlookers, it seemed insulting. To Kojiro, it was likely baffling and infuriating. The details of the duel have been mythologized over time, but consistent elements remain. Kojiro, frustrated by Musashi's demeanor, is said to have drawn his blade and thrown away his scabbard, a symbolic gesture that he would not need it again. Musashi, calm and unarmed up to that point, drew his wooden sword. The fight itself was brief. Accounts say Musashi struck first, aiming at Kojiro's head. Kojiro attempted a counter with his famed swallow cut, but Musashi's blow landed with brutal precision. The wooden blade cracked Kojiro's skull, killing him almost instantly. Some versions suggest he struck again to ensure the outcome. Others describe a single devastating blow. What is most telling about this encounter is not merely the outcome, but the intentional imbalance of it.
Musashi had chosen the location, the time, and even the psychological conditions of the duel. His wooden sword was longer than Kojiro's blade, giving him reach. His delay had worked on Kojiro's nerves, and his mindset, calm, cold, focused, had been shaped by dozens of past duels. To some, the victory seemed dishonorable. It lacked the symmetrical elegance of two warriors meeting on equal ground. But Musashi had never pursued symmetry. He pursued victory through understanding of self, of enemy, of terrain, of timing. This duel was not just physical, it was a test of mental discipline and strategic foresight.
After the duel, Musashi did not gloat or celebrate. He is said to have bowed, turned, and left the island in silence, boarding his boat and disappearing into the mist. The simplicity of his departure only heightened the legend. Kojiro's death marked the peak of Musashi's dueling career and also signaled a turning point. He never again engaged in another formal duel of such stature. What followed was a gradual shift in focus, from defeating others to mastering himself. The duel had proven what he needed it to prove. No opponent, regardless of polish or technique, could outmatch his approach. He had become something different, not merely a swordsman, but a living embodiment of strategy. In modern popular culture, the image of Musashi defeating Kojiro has become iconic. Two figures silhouetted on a lonely beach, the crashing waves bearing witness to the end of a rivalry. But in reality, there had never been a rivalry in the emotional sense. Musashi did not despise Kojiro. He did not seek vengeance or justice. What he sought, as always, was clarity. Even now, historians debate the details. Was the duel as lopsided as described? Did Musashi deliberately plan every element, or did legend exaggerate his cunning? We may never know. But what is certain is that this event cemented his status as one of Japan's most enigmatic and formidable swordsmen. In the years to come, Musashi would move beyond duels. He would begin to write, to reflect, and to teach. But the shadow of that duel on Ganryu Island followed him everywhere, whispered in training halls, remembered in scrolls, and immortalized in paintings. Next, we'll follow Musashi into his wandering years, no longer a young fighter seeking opponents, but a seasoned master searching for something more elusive than victory. After his famed duel with Sasaki Kojiro, Miyamoto Musashi did something unexpected. He withdrew, not from life, nor from swordsmanship, but from the cycle of fame that often traps warriors in endless repetition. There were no celebratory parades, no formal posts as swordmaster to a lord. Instead, he wandered. He walked through the countryside of Japan not as a man seeking recognition, but as one searching for understanding. The years that followed would define the deepest aspects of Musashi's philosophy, not through combat, but through observation. Musashi's wanderings took him through a changing Japan. The country was moving away from the chaos of the Sengoku period into the more stabilized rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. While relative peace was welcome for many, for the masterless samurai, the ronin, it was a time of uncertainty. Some sought patronage, others fell into obscurity. Musashi, however, chose the path of deliberate solitude. He visited temples, remote villages, and distant fiefdoms, offering guidance where requested, but rarely staying long. During these years,
Musashi began to refine his understanding of strategy beyond the sword. He observed carpenters as they measured timber, farmers as they tilled soil, potters as they shaped clay. To him, these crafts were not separate from martial skill. Each revealed truths about rhythm, timing, and form. He believed that the principles of swordsmanship existed in all things. One only needed to look closely. He took to calligraphy, painting, and sculpture, not as pastimes, but as extensions of his discipline. The stroke of a brush required the same commitment as the swing of a blade. A single movement, executed with clarity, was worth more than dozens performed in haste. His artwork, which survives to this day, is marked by simplicity, empty space and quiet lines, echoing the silent precision of his combat style.
One principle began to emerge more clearly in his thought, the concept of void. Not merely emptiness, but a space where awareness exists without form, a kind of mental neutrality that allows for total responsiveness. To Musashi, this was the highest level of mastery. A swordsman did not act from emotion or rigid technique, but from stillness, moving in alignment with the moment. He refused offers to serve under lords, despite their generosity. This, too, was telling. Most ronin would have seized the chance at a steady position, but Musashi resisted attachment, not out of arrogance, but from a deep belief that service would limit his exploration of truth. He carried no entourage, no banners, just a pair of swords and the weight of observation. It's during this time that Musashi began teaching, not large schools or formal academies, but quiet lessons to those he deemed ready. He emphasized not the memorization of forms, but the cultivation of perception. He instructed students to observe nature, to read without distraction, and to move their bodies in tune with breath and instinct. He believed that fighting skill was not an end point, but a gateway to understanding. He would sometimes spar with wooden swords or even without them. He wanted his students to experience discomfort, imbalance, and surprise. He believed mastery came not from comfort, but from exposure to confusion, an echo of his own early years. Few could match his depth, and fewer still could endure his silence. He spoke sparingly, often letting long pauses stretch between thoughts. The term Nitain Ichi Ryu, or the school of two heavens as one, began to circulate. His own style of swordsmanship. It emphasized the use of both long and short swords simultaneously, a concept unusual for its time. But more than the technique, it suggested a worldview, that opposing forces, heaven and earth, mind and body, self and other, could be unified through discipline.
As he aged, Musashi's body changed. His hair grew gray, his step slowed, but his perception sharpened. He became something more than a warrior. He was no longer interested in proving superiority in combat. His journals from this period reveal a man who had turned deeply inward, chronicling ideas with the precision of a monk, yet without the trappings of religion. He made few close relationships, though he adopted a son and had occasional students. His letters and writings speak little of affection or emotion. Instead, they focus on clarity of mind, awareness of surroundings, and understanding one's own nature. He cautioned against pride, distraction, and detachment. To Musashi,
These were the enemies more dangerous than any opponent. When he finally chose to settle, it was in a cave outside Kumamoto, Reigondo, the Spirit Rock Cave. There he began to write what would become his enduring legacy, the Book of 5 Rings. It was not intended for public consumption, but for one of his closest disciples. In its pages, he detailed not only combat principles, but the essence of strategy as a mental discipline. He divided the book into 5 scrolls: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. Each represented a different aspect of combat, mindset, and philosophy. Earth was foundational, water adaptable, fire intense, wind comparative, and void, emptiness filled with potential. Together, they formed a complete system, not just of martial technique, but of living. He did not romanticize combat. In fact, he warned against it. He advised understanding over engagement, awareness over aggression. To fight without reason was folly. To train without clarity was waste. His words were not meant to inspire the glory of warriors, but the composure of thinkers. Even as his health declined, Musashi continued writing, painting, and meditating. He sought not rest, but refinement. There was always more to observe, more to learn. When he sensed his time drawing near, he wrote his Dokko-do, the way of walking alone, a set of 21 precepts for living without attachment. It was a final gesture of simplicity, a distillation of decades of thought. His wandering years were not marked by fame or conquest, but by quiet accumulation, a deep internal search for harmony between mind, motion, and meaning. It was during this time that Musashi ceased to be merely a swordsman and became a philosopher in motion. Next, we'll explore the culmination of this journey, the Book of 5 Rings, its teachings, and the final stage of Musashi's life, when silence replaced the sword and wisdom left its mark more deeply than any blade.
As the final chapter of his life unfolded, Miyamoto Musashi turned his attention to consolidating decades of discipline, experience, and quiet observation into a singular text, the Book of 5 Rings, or Gorin no Sho. It was written not in the comfort of a court or the protection of a dojo, but in the shadowed quiet of Reigondo, a remote cave nestled in the hills outside Kumamoto. There, with his health waning and time growing short, Musashi wrote with clarity, not urgency. Each word was measured, deliberate, a continuation of the discipline that had defined his every step. The Book of 5 Rings is not a memoir. It is not a list of achievements, battles won, or names conquered. Instead, it is a terse and often cryptic distillation of Musashi's worldview. His language is not flowery, and he rarely explains. Instead, he offers principles, simple on the surface, but dense with implication. For Musashi, swordsmanship was never about technique alone. It was about perception, timing, balance, and the complete understanding of self and circumstance. The book is divided into 5 parts: earth, water, fire, wind, and void, each corresponding to a fundamental element in both martial practice and broader philosophy. The Earth Scroll lays the foundation. It speaks of grounding oneself, mastering basic stances, understanding the broader terrain of combat, both physically and mentally. Musashi emphasizes that without firm footing, no movement has purpose. It is not only literal balance he refers to,
but the mental balance necessary to remain unshaken. Water, the second scroll, flows around rigidity. Here, Musashi discusses adaptability. He writes about observing the enemy and adjusting one's movements like water filling the shape of its container. Strategy, he insists, must remain fluid. To lock into a single form is to become predictable. Flexibility, both in mind and body, allows the practitioner to respond without hesitation.
The fire scroll is more direct. It is about the heat of combat, the speed and aggression of engagement. But even here, Musashi discourages wild emotion. Fire is not fury, it is precision applied with energy. He speaks of rhythm, of seizing initiative, of disrupting an opponent's timing. For Musashi, even fire must be mastered through discipline. Wind offers comparisons. It explores the strategies of other schools, their strengths and limitations. Musashi examines them not with disdain, but with detachment. He does not mock, nor does he praise. He merely observes, noting where they differ from his own path. In this section, the reader sees his refusal to follow fashion, his skepticism of flamboyant forms, and his relentless preference for what works over what dazzles. Finally, void. It is the shortest, the most abstract, and arguably the most important. Here, Musashi approaches the heart of his philosophy, the cultivation of a mind so quiet, so free of distraction, that it can act without hesitation or thought. Void is not emptiness, it is clarity. It is the space where no plans are needed, because the practitioner moves in accordance with the truth of the moment. He likens this to instinct, but it is a cultivated instinct, one born of long training, detached observation, and deep self-awareness. Throughout the work, Musashi returns again and again to rhythm. The word appears often, more than one might expect in a manual about combat. But to Musashi, rhythm was everything. The rhythm of the body, the rhythm of an opponent, the rhythm of a duel, or even of daily life. He believed that mastery came not from memorizing forms, but from sensing rhythm and adapting to it. When one understood rhythm, timing emerged naturally, and victory followed with little effort. By the time the book was completed in 1645, Musashi was nearing the end. His strength had waned, though his mind remained clear. He offered the text to his student Terao Magonojo, not as a grand gift, but as a final lesson. He wrote also a shorter document, Dokodo, The Path of Aloneness, containing 21 precepts for living with detachment. These brief maxims reflect his deeply internal life. They reject luxury, ease, and dependence. They call for clarity, restraint, and the abandonment of attachment. They are not cheerful, but neither are they grim. They are simply distilled truth, as Musashi saw it.
He passed away shortly thereafter, reportedly in a seated, meditative position, surrounded by silence. There were no grand monuments, no lavish funeral, just a quiet end, fitting for a man who spent his life walking paths others dared not tread. Today, the Book of Five Rings is studied not only by martial artists, but also by business strategists, philosophers, and seekers of self-mastery.
Its terse phrasing and cryptic metaphors have been translated, interpreted, and debated. Yet its heart remains the same, a manual not for fighting, but for clarity. A record of one man's relentless pursuit of a life lived without distraction, without pretense, without compromise. Musashi's legacy is not found in statues or shrines, but in pages filled with steady, measured thought. His story offers no promise of glory, only the long and often lonely road of discipline. In this way, he remains one of history's most quietly influential figures, not a conqueror of kingdoms, but a master of rhythm, perception, and the stillness between movements. From here, our narrative turns away from the individual and looks beneath the surface, into the earth itself, where the legacies of samurai were buried in ritual, secrecy, and stone. Next, we uncover the strange and silent world of samurai burials and the truths they left behind.
Beneath the quiet hills of Japan lie mounds of earth shaped not by nature, but by custom, status, and memory. These burial sites, known as kofun in earlier periods and later adapted by the samurai class, carry with them stories not spoken aloud, only hinted at in stone markers and faded ritual scripts. The graves of samurai were not simply resting places, they were curated expressions of belief, honor, social structure, and lingering fear of the dead. Burial practices for the warrior class evolved slowly across the centuries. Early in Japan's feudal period, cremation was still common, especially among Buddhist practitioners. However, burial traditions among samurai were never dictated by religion alone. They were shaped by clan identity, regional customs, and above all, status. A powerful daimyo might rest beneath a meticulously constructed mound encircled by a moat, with a gravestone inscribed with calligraphy in deep-cut kanji. A lesser retainer, by contrast, might be laid in a plain wooden box and set into a rural hillside, marked only by a stone post and the name of his family line. The graves were often aligned with geomantic principles, borrowed in part from Chinese feng shui traditions, and intended to preserve spiritual harmony between the dead and the living. Samurai were expected to live in accordance with Confucian ideals of order and discipline. Even in death, their resting places mirrored that same demand for balance. Graveyards were positioned near temple complexes or clan shrines, tucked into slopes that faced auspicious directions, away from dangerous wind or spiritual contamination. Funeral rites varied. A high-ranking warrior would typically be washed and dressed in ceremonial robes, often white, the color of death and purity in Japanese tradition. A katana or wakizashi might be laid at his side. In some cases, a favorite poem or prayer was written and buried with him, believed to accompany the soul on its final journey. For the most elite, the burial became a political event. Lords and vassals attended, monks chanted lengthy sutras, and entire retinues followed the casket in solemn procession. Yet not all samurai died in such order. On the battlefield, the bodies of the fallen were often buried hastily. Mass graves, known as goryozuka, have been uncovered centuries later, revealing bundles of armor, rusted swords, and fractured bones pressed together under layers of earth. These were not noble graves. They were necessities,
dug quickly in the aftermath of violence, with little ceremony beyond the placement of stone or wooden markers. Sometimes names were carved. Sometimes only the date and the battle were remembered. In the Sengoku period, an era of near constant war, death came so frequently that some clans created temporary cemeteries specifically for combat casualties. After major conflicts, officials would often attempt to collect the heads of enemies for identification, making burial secondary to accounting. In some regions, local villagers were paid to bury the dead or to offer simple Buddhist prayers on their behalf, ensuring the spirits would not wander. For those who took their own lives through ritual suicide, seppuku, the aftermath was more complex. Despite the gruesome nature of the act, it was considered an honorable death, and the remains of the fallen were often treated with great reverence. Samurai who committed seppuku for political protest or personal disgrace were buried in family plots or temple grounds. The blade used might be enshrined beside them, and their death poem preserved by descendants. However, if the suicide had been deemed dishonorable or forbidden by higher authority, their names might be erased, their burial unmarked, their memory intentionally allowed to fade. Graves of particularly important figures were sometimes protected or hidden. In times of unrest, families feared that tombs might be desecrated by rivals or looters. This led to the creation of decoy graves, false burial markers placed in prominent places, while the true remains were interred elsewhere. Some of these misdirections were so effective that even modern archaeologists struggle to identify real from symbolic.
Over the centuries, many samurai cemeteries fell into disrepair. In some cases, forests reclaimed the stones. In others, new urban expansion paved over centuries of quiet rest. Yet some were preserved, not for reasons of sentimentality, but due to lingering fear. In Japanese folklore, the dead could return. A restless warrior, improperly buried or forgotten, might manifest as an onryo, a vengeful spirit. Rituals were performed regularly to appease the dead. Graves were cleaned, incense offered, and anniversaries observed. These practices had less to do with honoring the past than with maintaining peace in the present. Modern excavations of samurai graves have revealed more than bones. Archaeologists have uncovered family crests etched into armor plates, rare coins buried in hands or pouches, and even remains of ink brushes or scroll fragments. In some rare cases, entire battle uniforms were interred, suggesting that for some, the warrior's identity was to remain intact even in death. There is a curious stillness to samurai burial sites. Unlike the grand mausoleums of emperors or the intricate necropolises of Europe, these graves are often modest, even anonymous. A simple column of stone, a name half worn by rain, a hollow carved into the hillside. But within that simplicity lies a kind of permanence. They do not demand attention. They endure. As we leave behind the earth where warriors rest, our attention shifts to what they left behind, not on paper or stone, but in burial itself. In the next segment, we explore the treasures, secrets, and strange customs uncovered in samurai burial mounds, and what they reveal about the hopes, fears, and contradictions of those who once wielded the sword.
Not all samurai entered death with only silence and soil to accompany them. Beneath the burial mounds, alongside bones and rusted blades, there were other objects deliberately placed, carefully chosen.
Treasures, yes, but not in the glittering, golden sense one might expect from kings or emperors. These were personal, symbolic, and in some cases, curiously enigmatic. The practice of burying items with the dead was common across cultures, and among samurai, it revealed not only wealth, but belief, status, and intention. The most common item buried with a samurai was, unsurprisingly, the sword. Depending on the period and the rank of the deceased, this might be a short-bladed wakizashi, a ceremonial katana, or even a broken blade that had served faithfully until the end. These weapons were not interred for utility in the afterlife, as with other ancient warrior cultures. Instead, they acted as tokens of identity. The sword was more than a tool. It was the soul of the samurai, a representation of discipline, responsibility, and rank. Even a blunt or unsharpened blade could serve as a final gesture of continuity, of who the man had been, even after death. However, not all swords were equal. Some were adorned with intricate tsuba, handguards featuring family crests, mythical creatures, or religious motifs. Others bore the signature of a famous swordsmith, often engraved along with tang and invisible once the sword was mounted. A few swords unearthed centuries later have revealed inscriptions on the inside of the scabbard, notes or prayers hidden from the world, meant only for the deceased and perhaps the divine. More curious were the personal objects: brushes for calligraphy, inkstones, tiny scrolls containing Buddhist sutras, sometimes reduced to miniature format and folded into lacquered boxes. Some graves revealed carefully wrapped pieces of poetry, either written by the deceased or by a revered master. These items seem to suggest a vision of the afterlife not as a place of conflict, but of quiet reflection. A samurai might spend eternity not in battle, but in contemplation, surrounded by the written word and the echo of culture.
Coins, too, were sometimes buried with the dead. Japan, during the feudal period, experienced long stretches of barter economy, but minted coins did exist, particularly those borrowed from Chinese models. In many cases, these coins were not placed for transactional purposes. Rather, they functioned as symbolic offerings. A handful of copper coins, wrapped in cloth or stored in a small pouch, could signify humility, devotion, or the hope of safe passage. In rare instances, a coin would be marked or cut in a specific way, indicating a clan-specific funerary custom lost to time. Clothing remnants, fragments of silk, patterns dyed with family emblems have also survived in certain burials, especially when sealed in airtight conditions. While not always identifiable, these traces suggest that some samurai were buried in formal attire, not armor. The garments may have included inner robes, tied sashes, and even elements of court-style fashion, hinting at aspirations beyond the battlefield. In high-ranking graves, particularly those of daimyo, or distinguished generals, more opulent items have occasionally surfaced. Lacquered boxes with gold dust decorations, tea ceremony utensils, including ceramic cups or miniature iron kettles, seals carved from jade or ivory, even folding fans, delicately painted and folded with care, have been discovered. These were not objects of necessity. They were markers of status, of cultural refinement, and of legacy. Among the most intriguing finds are the personal talismans.
These might include carved figures of deities, small beads worn around the neck, or amulets made from wood and ink, inscribed with Buddhist mantras. Some were wrapped tightly in string and cloth, clearly carried during life and kept close even in death. Their placement within the grave, sometimes held in hand, sometimes tied around the wrist, suggests a deeply intimate purpose. These were not simply symbols, they were companions. Yet, for all the intent behind these treasures, many remain puzzling. Archaeologists have found graves containing seemingly mundane items: a broken comb, a piece of sharpened bone, a wooden game piece, a stone with no markings. Some theorize these were sentimental, belonging to a spouse, a child, or a moment in time the deceased could not leave behind. Others suggest they were offerings made by mourners, each with a personal meaning now lost to history. One particularly mysterious practice observed in a limited number of graves involves the burial of small mirrors. These were often round, polished on one side, and etched with patterns on the reverse. Mirrors in Japanese culture held symbolic weight associated with purity, reflection, and spiritual passage. Placing one in a grave could have signified self-examination, or perhaps a way for the deceased to see their way into the next life. Some scholars speculate they were used in protective rituals, deflecting malevolent forces that might disturb the spirit's journey. Grave goods were not always placed with reverence. There is evidence in some cases of grave robbing, especially in periods of famine or civil unrest. Items like valuable swords, lacquerware, or coin pouches were tempting, and burial sites located near battlefields or abandoned shrines were often vulnerable. This led to changes in burial practice: deeper graves, hidden tombs, and even false chambers meant to deceive would-be looters. Some families went so far as to bury empty coffins or dummies, while keeping the real remains in temple crypts. Still, the practice of burying treasures persisted. It was not about wealth alone. It was a final statement, one last arrangement of identity. In a life bound by duty, code, and hierarchy, the grave offered a rare moment of personal expression, even if no one was meant to see it. As we move forward, our next focus will be broader in scope. We shift now from individual graves to collective ones, from items buried with reverence to bodies laid in haste. What happens when war leaves no time for poetry or talismans? When the dead are not remembered, but merely recorded? In the next subsegment, we explore the discovery of mass graves from samurai battles, and what these chaotic resting places tell us about the rhythm and rupture of feudal conflict. Not every samurai fell in a moment of solitary honor. Many died in chaos, amid mud, blood, and confusion, on fields where bodies stacked faster than they could be buried. These were not ceremonial deaths, and their aftermath left a different kind of mark: mass graves. Unlike the carefully arranged tombs of individual warriors, these burial sites were pragmatic, rushed, and often brutal in their composition. But centuries later, they reveal a grim layer of the samurai world, one that rarely makes its way into the carefully preserved legends. The first signs of mass graves typically emerge during construction work or agricultural expansion in rural Japan. A dig for new foundations uncovers a cluster of bones. Archaeologists are called in. The bones are jumbled, some bearing sword marks, others fractured at odd angles. There are no caskets, no personal objects, no order. And yet,
The pattern is unmistakable: a battlefield grave. Most of these sites are dated between the Sengoku period and early Edo period, eras defined by civil strife, shifting allegiances, and brutal sieges. One particularly well-documented example lies near the site of the 1575 Battle of Nagashino. Excavations conducted decades ago revealed dozens of skeletal remains, many of which showed evidence of blunt force trauma or decapitation. The skulls were not aligned. The arms were scattered. It was not a burial. It was a disposal. Some bodies were missing limbs. Some were stacked chest to back, a sign they had been dumped quickly. The absence of armor, recovered rarely and only in fragments, suggests scavenging had already occurred by the time these graves were filled. The dead were stripped, perhaps by the enemy, or perhaps by peasants desperate for any salvageable material. Whatever the case, there was no dignity in the internment. Researchers studying these grave sites have used isotopic analysis to determine the diets and origins of the deceased. In some cases, this reveals that the soldiers came from distant provinces, recruited or conscripted into armies with little loyalty to the lords they served. Their bodies came to rest far from home, in unfamiliar soil, with no marker to speak their names. This anonymity contrasts sharply with the way elite samurai deaths were treated: memorials, shrines, even temple sponsorships in their honor. For the common foot soldier, often categorized as ashigaru, no such remembrance existed.
And yet, even in this anonymity, stories begin to emerge. The pattern of wounds, the angle of a blade strike, the number of bodies in a layer. These become narrative tools for historians and archaeologists. In some cases, an entire skirmish can be reconstructed by reading the position of the dead, who stood, who fled, who fought to the end. These graves become the final battlefield maps. Occasionally, unusual arrangements complicate the picture. One excavation unearthed a line of skulls arranged in a row, each one marked with a clean blade cut. It suggested execution, perhaps of captured enemy soldiers. Another site showed signs of hurried burning before burial, with bones charred but not consumed. Fire may have been used for disease control or simply to speed decomposition. Whatever the motive, it was a functional act, not a ritual one. The environmental conditions of burial sites also inform the historical record. In mountain regions, graves were sometimes dug into shallow rock layers, with stones piled loosely above. In plains, trenches were hastily cut into wet soil, then refilled with a mix of dirt and ash. In some coastal regions, erosion has exposed bones over time, occasionally leading to the rediscovery of burial sites long forgotten or intentionally obscured. Some of these mass graves were not battlefield-related at all, but rather aftermaths of castle sieges, where civilian populations were caught in the fallout. The siege of Odawara in 1590, for instance, displaced thousands, many of whom died not by sword, but by starvation or disease. Excavations near the castle grounds have revealed communal burial pits containing men, women, and children, again with little separation and even less formality. The distinction between soldier and civilian, noble and peasant, vanished in the face of mass death.
Yet in these grave sites, there is also silence. No writing, no epitaphs. The stories they hold are told only through absence, the absence of personal objects,
of documented names, of any marker that separates one life from another. For a society as concerned with ritual, honor, and record-keeping as feudal Japan, the very lack of these elements in such graves speaks volumes. In recent years, there has been growing interest in preserving these sites, not for glorification, but for remembrance. Local governments have, in some cases, erected modest plaques. Museums have reconstructed burial layers with casts and replicas, giving visitors a chance to understand the stark realities of war without romanticism. In schools, these sites are sometimes included in regional history lessons, not as tales of bravery, but as quiet evidence of scale and suffering. Still, many of these graves remain unmarked, known only to a few specialists. Some are buried again after documentation, left untouched out of respect or necessity. Others lie beneath roads, buildings, or fields. Their presence is not always disclosed, especially if development is prioritized. The dead, once abandoned in haste, are sometimes abandoned a second time. But the bones remember. They hold their stories tightly. They speak of strategy and panic, of loyalty and desertion. They record the final moments of men who did not choose their graves, but whose remains now form a quiet archive of feudal violence. Their story is not told in chronicles or epic poems. It is written in calcium, in the angle of a broken femur, in the way one body leans into another. In our final subsegment for this chapter, we will turn to a different kind of death, one that was not hidden or hurried, but instead ritualized to an extraordinary degree. Ritual suicide, or seppuku, occupies a prominent space in the mythology of the samurai. But what does the archaeological record say about it? Can such a private, prescribed act leave a physical trace in the soil? We'll explore these questions next as we examine the final layer of samurai burial customs.
Among the most iconic and heavily mythologized aspects of samurai culture is the act of ritual suicide, known as seppuku. Often translated as belly cutting, it was far more than a physical act. It was a cultural expression of accountability, resolve, and control in the face of disgrace or failure. But while literature and historical chronicles describe the ceremonial intricacies of seppuku in vivid detail, white robes, written death poems, the presence of a second to perform decapitation, archaeology presents a different kind of narrative. It's quieter, less ornamental, and sometimes surprisingly incomplete. Archaeological evidence of seppuku is rare and often ambiguous. This is because those who committed it were usually of high status, and their bodies were handled with care. Burial sites were private, carefully maintained, and frequently destroyed or repurposed over the centuries. When remains are uncovered, the signs of suicide, especially those involving abdominal wounds, are not always easily distinguishable from natural decomposition or post-mortem disturbance. Still, there have been finds. In certain elite graves, archaeologists have encountered skeletons with odd abdominal blade marks, shallow and parallel,
consistent with the motion described in texts, a horizontal incision from left to right. These cuts are typically found alongside the remains of ornamental short swords, or tanto, placed deliberately with the body. In one instance in central Japan, a body believed to be that of a retainer from the 17th century was buried with a tanto still partially embedded in the rib cage. The absence of armor, the ceremonial positioning, and the presence of a lacquered box containing what appeared to be a folded letter all suggested that this was not an execution, but a voluntary act. More often, however, the physical evidence is less direct. Burial sites associated with known incidents of mass junshi, ritual suicide committed following the death of one's lord, provide stronger collective patterns. After the death of a prominent daimyo, it was not uncommon for loyal retainers to follow him into death. Historical records mention dozens of such incidents, and in a few cases, burial mounds containing multiple high-status individuals, all male, buried in robes with accompanying swords, have been uncovered. Some of these bodies display damage consistent with self-inflicted wounds, while others showed cleaner cuts to the neck or spine, likely from the act of decapitation performed by a designated second known as a kaishinakin.
Interestingly, while written accounts of seppuku emphasize the ritual and honor involved, the archaeological record suggests that many such deaths were not entirely idealized. Bodies buried in haste, or those lacking proper garments or ritual items, point to circumstances where suicide may have been expected or coerced, but not necessarily supported by full ceremonial context. In the Edo period, for example, officials sometimes forced lower-ranking samurai to commit seppuku as punishment for disgrace or corruption. In these cases, the suicide was a spectacle of order, but the aftermath was not one of reverence. The bodies were removed quickly, sometimes dumped rather than buried with distinction. There is also the question of location. Seppuku, when performed voluntarily, was usually done indoors, in a private room, or within the home compound. This isolation further complicates archaeological study, as any signs left behind, blood patterns, tools, written notes, would have been cleaned or lost over time. The graves themselves, often small and marked only with a stone or a wooden placard, are difficult to distinguish from other elite burials without textual confirmation. Nevertheless, the presence of seppuku in the archaeological record, however faint, provides a counterpoint to the ceremonial depictions in films and literature. It reminds us that even the most formal acts of death were carried out under physical constraints. The body reacts in unpredictable ways. Swords do not always cut cleanly. People flinch, assistants falter. And so the pristine imagery of an honorable death is interrupted by the messy, tangible evidence of the act itself. Bones marked by imperfect blades, wrists fractured in the process, sometimes even tooth marks where the subject bit down on cloth or rope to stifle pain. There is also a quiet debate among historians and archaeologists about the psychological landscape of those who took part. Was seppuku always an act of belief and conviction, or was it sometimes done out of pressure, fear of shame, or simply because no other path was acceptable within the rigid social order? The archaeological record cannot answer these questions directly, but it can show us how these deaths were treated, and the way the dead were buried, or not buried at all, tells us something about how society viewed these acts, with reverence or with utility.
Modern excavations continue to uncover isolated examples. In one small site, near the remains of a former provincial castle, archaeologists discovered a lone male skeleton, positioned on a lacquered wooden mat, with a tanto at his side and a shallow ceramic dish stained with dried ink. The assumption was that he had written something before his death, perhaps a final letter or poem. But the paper was gone. Only the object remained. A final gesture, preserved not by design, but by accident. And so, the practice of seppuku, though immortalized in text and imagery, remains elusive when sought through physical evidence. It is remembered more often through metaphor and legacy than through remains. But even in its quietest traces, it speaks of a society that placed ritual and control at the heart of its understanding of life and death. A society where even the final breath was choreographed, and where honor, real or performed, had to be visible down to the last moment. With that, we conclude our third segment on the gory secrets of samurai burial mounds. In our final chapter, we will leave the battlefield and the grave behind and step into a different kind of world, a world of poetry, silk, and seasonal rituals. The Imperial Court of Heian, Kyoto awaits, offering us a glimpse into the refined life of those far removed from the common strife.
In the courtly halls of Heian, Kyoto, where the seasons turned gently and the world outside the palace seemed distant, life unfolded in quiet, ceremonial rhythms. This was not the realm of peasants or warriors, but of aristocrats, poets, and courtiers, men and women who measured their days not by labor or conquest, but by composition, appearance, and subtle gestures. It was a world ruled by etiquette and aesthetics, where a poorly chosen word could do more damage than a blade, and where silks and syllables carried the weight of one's standing. The Heian period, spanning from the late 8th to the late 12th century, marked one of the most refined and most insular eras of Japanese history. The capital at Heian-kyo, present-day Kyoto, was a place where the imperial family and their noble retainers lived lives far removed from the harsh realities of rural Japan. Here, a nobleman's fortune was not forged on the battlefield, but in his ability to navigate court rituals, compose verse, and present himself with unerring grace. The visual centerpiece of courtly life was, without question, clothing. Layers upon layers of silks were worn not just for warmth or modesty, but as a form of non-verbal communication. A noblewoman's outfit might include 12 or more layers, each dyed in a specific color to reflect the season, the occasion, or her personal sentiments. These color combinations had names, some poetic, some symbolic. A green outer robe over plum-colored underlayers might evoke spring buds in bloom, while silver over pale blue could suggest morning frost. The court did not just wear beauty, it codified it. These garments, known as junihitoe for women and suktai for men, were heavy and time-consuming to put on. Attendants were often required to dress the nobility, ensuring each layer was properly aligned and that no single fabric clashed with the desired emotional tone. To those unfamiliar, this might seem excessive, but within the court, one's clothing was as expressive as one's words, perhaps even more so.
But more important than what one wore was what one wrote. Poetry was the soul of Heian culture, not a diversion, but a social necessity. Conversations were frequently conducted in verse, and the exchange of poetry between two individuals could define the nature of their relationship. Romantic interest, apology, admiration, all could be articulated through the precise arrangement of syllables. The preferred form was the waka, a 31-syllable structure consisting of 5 lines. Mastery of this form was essential, especially during courtly poetry contests, or uta awase, where nobles competed not for fame or wealth, but for reputation and recognition. These contests were formal affairs. Participants were given themes in advance, perhaps the first snowfall or a fleeting love, and tasked with producing poetry that was not only technically flawless, but emotionally resonant. A panel of judges, themselves often poets of standing, would deliberate, and winners were announced with ceremonial gravity. Such events might span an entire evening, interspersed with court music, delicate cuisine, and long moments of contemplative silence. Losing was not shameful, but winning could elevate one's social position and secure future opportunities. Beyond competition, poetry served as a vehicle for communication within the labyrinthine social structures of the palace. Noble women, often secluded behind screens or curtains, would use poetry as their voice. A particularly eloquent verse could attract the attention of a potential suitor or curry favor with a higher-ranking figure. Conversely, a poorly phrased poem might close doors forever. Diaries from noble women of the period, such as those by Sei Shonagon or Murasaki Shikubu, revealed the sheer weight of poetic skill in everyday court life. The atmosphere of these gatherings was meticulously crafted. Incense perfumed the air, often mixed by hand according to ancient recipes. Lanterns cast soft light across polished wood floors. Calligraphy brushes were prepared in advance, with inkstones ground slowly, the motion itself a kind of meditation. Every detail was part of the performance, and silence, too, played its role. Silence before a poem was offered, silence as it was read, silence as its meaning settled.
The presence of the seasons was constant, not merely as background, but as active participants in courtly life. The bloom of cherry blossoms signaled new beginnings and gentle melancholy. The red leaves of autumn reminded courtiers of life's transience. Seasonal references in poetry were expected, mandatory even. Nature was not just outside the window, it was embedded in language, in clothing, in thought. Despite the refinement,
Life at court was not without its constraints. The pressure to conform to aesthetic standards could be stifling. Creativity was prized, but only within strict boundaries. A poem too bold might be considered inappropriate. A garment too vivid, vulgar. Even laughter had its decorum. Courtiers were not free to live as they pleased. They were bound by the invisible net of tradition and precedent, one that offered security but little room to breathe. And beneath it all, the fragility of their world was known. Diaries and letters from the period often contain reflections on impermanence, of love, of youth, of position. To live at the Heian court was to live in a kind of cultivated dream, aware at every moment that it could vanish with the shifting of power or the decline of one's family name. Still, for those who mastered its rhythms, life in the palace could be deeply fulfilling. The pursuit of elegance, the crafting of language, the communion through verse, it offered a kind of immortality. Long after the buildings have crumbled and the robes have faded, their words remain. And in reading them, one feels not just the weight of history, but the delicate, deliberate grace with which they lived.
Beneath the refined silks and behind the bamboo screens of Heian, Kyoto, court life moved not only to the rhythms of poetry and aesthetics, but also to the quiet current of intrigue. The aristocracy of the Imperial court was composed not merely of poets and aesthetes, but also of careful tacticians, navigating complex networks of alliance, favor, and rivalry. Among them, noble women played a subtle yet formidable role, weaving influence not through open conflict, but through letters, glances, and proximity to power. The Heian court was governed as much by shadow as by light. Formal power rested with the emperor, yet in practice the Fujiwara clan held much of the political control during the height of the period. Their daughters were married into the imperial family, and behind the veil of these unions lay a strategy to dominate succession. It was a delicate balance. Open ambition could not be voiced. Everything was cloaked in ritual, in symbolic gesture, in carefully placed correspondence. Nothing direct, nothing said too loudly. Women at court were rarely seen by outsiders. Their lives were lived behind screens, veils, and curtains, physically separated even during conversation. Yet their isolation did not equate to powerlessness. On the contrary, a noble woman's salon could be a center of cultural and political gravity. Through their wit, their poetry, and their hosting of intimate gatherings, these women could form alliances, influence court appointments, or guide imperial affections. Influence did not flow in straight lines. It curved, winding through halls scented with incense and steeped in formality. Letters exchanged through intermediaries were the bloodline of these relationships. A letter from one noblewoman to another might comment on the weather or reference a poem, yet within its phrasing could lie coded implications, criticisms, veiled warnings, subtle invitations to align or oppose. Every word mattered.
every brushstroke could shift reputation. To misread a letter was to misstep in a dance from which there was often no recovery.
Much of the intrigue centered around imperial favor. The emperor's affection could elevate a family's status or plunge it into obscurity. Concubines competed quietly for his attention, not with open gestures, but through poems, graceful letters, and moments orchestrated to appear spontaneous. A chance encounter during a seasonal celebration, a beautifully timed verse placed where he might see it. These were the weapons in a courtly contest for influence that no one acknowledged, yet everyone played. Noble women also served as intermediaries between powerful male figures. A woman whose brother served in the ministry of ceremonial, for example, might be courted for her ability to sway his opinion, or at least pass along certain thoughts, disguised as casual observations. To navigate these channels effectively required discretion, intelligence, and a firm grasp of social nuance. The most successful court women were not the most beautiful, but the most perceptive. Jealousy, though rarely spoken of openly, lingered at the edges of this world. A well-placed rumor could undo a reputation. Diaries from the time hint at rivalries that festered over decades, fed not by direct insult, but by exclusion, neglect, or the subtle elevation of one's adversary. And while a woman's worth was tied to her lineage, her influence depended heavily on her ability to avoid scandal, while remaining ever present in the emperor's or a regent's awareness. One of the most famous chroniclers of this period, Murasaki Shikibu, author of The Tale of Genji, provides glimpses of this courtly atmosphere in her own diary. Though revered today as a literary genius, Murasaki herself often expressed discomfort with the social competitiveness of court life. She found the need for constant self-presentation exhausting, even as she participated in it with measured skill. Her reflections reveal the tension between genuine artistic pursuit and the demands of survival in a world governed by unspoken codes. Another noble woman, Sei Shonagon, author of the Pillow Book, approached courtly life with a sharper tongue and more pronounced wit. Her diary records delight in clever conversation and a kind of merciless commentary on those who failed to live up to the refined expectations of the palace. She catalogued both beauty and foolishness with equal clarity, reinforcing how closely aesthetic and social success were entwined.
The court was also a place where age held ambiguous weight. Youth was prized, especially in women, yet age conferred a kind of immunity. Older noblewomen, no longer players in romantic or reproductive politics, could wield quiet authority as mentors, advisors, or spiritual guides. Their words were often taken seriously, precisely because they were no longer viewed through the lens of competition. These elder women sometimes kept detailed diaries, chronicling court events not merely as historians, but as quiet observers who understood the power of silence.
At times, even small moments of oversight could cascade into consequences. A poorly chosen phrase in a letter, an incorrect flower arrangement during a ritual, or failing to respond promptly to a poem, all could signal disrespect or emotional distance. In a court where nothing was spoken plainly, these symbolic missteps were not minor, they were seismic. Yet, for all its fragility, this world had a strange resilience. Families rose and fell, alliances shifted, emperors abdicated or died, and still the court endured. Its rituals continued, its aesthetic evolved only slightly, and its players learned to adapt. Even those cast out, disgraced by rumors or sidelined by age, often found ways to write their stories, preserving their voice in a world where so little was allowed to be said outright. In this refined environment of whispered intentions and silk-curtained ambition, life was not defined by war or labor, but by the constant maintenance of appearance and tone, and those who thrived did so not by force, but by mastering the subtle architecture of courtly intrigue.
Heian Kyoto's imperial court was governed by an overt hierarchy of rank, office, and pedigree. But beneath this visible structure lay subtler hierarchies, ones that were no less powerful for being unofficial. These hidden layers of status shaped everything from seating arrangements at banquets to whose poem would be read first during a seasonal contest. Within this stratified world, romantic entanglements operated not as diversions, but as social instruments, capable of shaping reputations, forging alliances, or quietly ending careers. Court rank was formally defined, beginning with the emperor and descending through an intricate network of ministers, courtiers, and retainers. However, a person's real influence often diverged from their official title. A minor court official, whose sister was married to a powerful regent, could exert more sway than a high-ranking bureaucrat with no familial ties. In this system, proximity to power, measured in family connections, salon invitations, and whispered confidences, mattered more than public titles. Among noblewomen, beauty was esteemed, but lineage remained paramount. Even the most graceful and poetic woman would find her prospects limited without an appropriate family background. Yet even here, exceptions and anomalies abounded. There are accounts of women from lesser lineages rising in esteem through wit, literary ability, or their skill at navigating the emotional currents of court. One could not alter one's birth, but with the right demeanor and strategic conduct, one could adjust how that birth was perceived. Romantic liaisons, though veiled in euphemism and ritual, were central to court culture. Affairs were not unusual, nor were they necessarily scandalous unless handled poorly. In Heian courtship, discretion was the highest virtue. The act of sending poetry back and forth, especially under cover of darkness or via a trusted intermediary, was as much a social game as a genuine expression of feeling.
Successful courtship depended on perfect timing, refined phrasing, and an understanding of seasonal symbolism. A single misplaced reference could mark one as inelegant or, worse, socially ignorant.
But missteps did occur. Sometimes these were innocent, a young courtier pressing his affections too eagerly, or a lady offering a reply that was too cold too soon. At other times, mistakes were deliberate, attempts to undermine a rival by publicly exposing a private affair. The revelation of such liaisons could result in quiet exile, a sudden retreat to a religious life, or the more ambiguous punishment of social isolation. No formal censure was needed. To be no longer invited, to have one's poems ignored, to become invisible, that was often punishment enough. The diaries of court women offer a rich, if partial, glimpse into these affairs. Murasaki Shikibu's writing, for instance, betrays a deep ambivalence about romantic relationships at court. While she recognized the allure of such entanglements, she also observed the fragility they introduced into a woman's position. Even for someone as accomplished as Murasaki, the balance between admiration and exposure was delicate. Sei Shonagon, by contrast, appears more at ease within the social whirl. Her pillow book records moments of flirtation, minor humiliations, and the occasional triumph with a tone of cool detachment. Yet even in her lively anecdotes, there is an awareness that favor could shift suddenly, and with it, the entire trajectory of a courtier's life. For those on the fringes of power, romantic scandal could be used strategically. An affair with a prominent official might lift one's family into temporary relevance. A well-handled separation where dignity was maintained and blame subtly deflected could preserve a woman's standing while weakening her former lovers. These maneuvers were conducted with a sophistication that belied their apparent lightness. Reputation was currency, and romantic ties were among its most volatile investments.
Even within marriages, the rules were pliable. Polygamy among the elite was common, and a man might maintain several wives and concubines, each with varying degrees of influence. The household of such a man became a political entity of its own, with tensions, alliances, and rivalries playing out not unlike the broader court itself. In these intimate domains, women held remarkable control over atmosphere and direction, especially when children, and by extension inheritance, were involved. One of the most curious elements of Heian romance was the emphasis on anonymity and the idealization of the unseen. It was not uncommon for lovers to remain behind screens, for correspondence to pass through multiple hands, for voices to carry more meaning than faces. This created a kind of romantic aesthetic where mystery itself was a form of beauty. Physical closeness, when it did occur, was often fleeting and carefully managed. Many affairs lived longer in the space of poetry than in any shared chamber.
Scandals sometimes extended beyond romantic boundaries. A poorly timed comment about another courtier's attire, an overstep in a poem implying criticism, or the careless mention of a past affair, these too could spiral. Because so much of Heian life was about appearances, breaches of decorum were felt acutely. Yet rather than direct confrontation, the preferred mechanism of accountability was exclusion. A person might still attend official functions, but find themselves quietly passed over, unmentioned, or seated just far enough away to signal disgrace. Amid this landscape of muted drama, the greatest skill a courtier could possess was stillness. The ability to remain unruffled while events swirled around them, to answer every social tremor with balance and calm, was more admired than boldness or even passion. It was a lesson taught early, especially to women, whose power lay not in command, but in presence, the precise modulation of voice, gesture, and timing. To navigate these invisible hierarchies required years of observation, self-discipline, and a tolerance for ambiguity. Unlike in later samurai codes of conduct or military systems of loyalty, the Heian court prized subtlety over clarity. One did not win favor by announcing intentions, but by reflecting them back at just the right angle. Romance was not the goal, but the medium through which power moved, slowly and often unseen.
In Heian, Kyoto, the passage of time was not merely marked by calendars or celestial events. It was performed, cultivated, and embodied through rituals aligned with the rhythm of the seasons. These rituals were neither solemn nor spontaneous, but meticulously designed expressions of elegance and harmony. For the court, time moved not in hours and minutes, but in cycles of blossoms, scents, colors, and ceremonial acts. The result was a way of life that merged art, nature, and custom into a quiet, ongoing performance. Each season brought with it a series of expected gestures. Spring demanded the viewing of cherry blossoms, ideally timed to coincide with their fullest bloom, but also their most fleeting moment. Parties were held beneath the trees, with poetry exchanged on fans and scrolls, often referencing the ephemerality of beauty. The falling petals were not seen as a loss, but a metaphor, the elegant sadness of things passing. Court members would often compete to express this sentiment most gracefully in verse, their reputations rising or falling on a single line of poetry. Summer was marked by incense competitions, moon viewing, and rituals to ward off illness. In a time when the heat could be oppressive and disease unpredictable, the act of burning delicately blended incense in ornate containers became both a spiritual and aesthetic defense. Participants would test their knowledge of fragrance blends, identifying combinations by scent alone. These gatherings took place in shaded pavilions or bamboo groves, with silk screens gently stirred by the evening breeze and the distant hum of insects offering a background lull. Autumn was perhaps the most reflective season, filled with subdued beauty and the melancholy of approaching cold.
Maple leaves, dyed in deep red and gold, were admired during strolls through curated gardens. Moon viewing parties gained new significance, often accompanied by the soft tones of court music played on stringed instruments. Poetry once again took center stage, now focused on themes of aging, longing, and transience. The court did not resist the sorrow of the season. It embraced it with controlled emotion and literary form.
Winter rituals, while more austere, brought their own form of comfort. The New Year was the most significant occasion, preceded by days of quiet preparation. Homes were cleaned, garments repaired or replaced, and offerings made to ensure a propitious start. Snow, when it fell, was not merely weather, it was an invitation. Scenes of snowy landscapes were painted, described in letters, and recalled from memory. There were few greater compliments in Heian society than a remark on how one resembled the stillness of winter, suggesting poise, introspection, and purity of presence. Intertwined with these seasonal observances were the refined arts, which defined one's cultivation more than rank or wealth. Calligraphy was not simply about handwriting. It was an extension of one's character. The angle of a brushstroke, the spacing of words, even the choice of paper and ink color conveyed as much as the content. Those who wrote poorly or clumsily were quietly pitied, even if their status was high. Conversely, a beautifully penned letter from a lesser-known courtier could open doors previously closed. Music, too, played a central role. Instruments such as the biwa, a type of lute, koto, a zither, and shakuhachi, a flute, were played not for entertainment alone, but as meditative disciplines. A skilled musician could evoke an entire season or emotion with a single melodic line. Musical ability was not reserved for professionals. Courtiers were expected to be proficient. Music accompanied poetry readings, garden strolls, and even the act of writing itself. The creation and appreciation of layered clothing, known as juni hitoe for women, was another refined practice. Color coordination was dictated not only by personal taste, but by season and occasion. A noblewoman's outfit could contain multiple symbolic pairings: plum blossom over snow for late winter, or pine green layered with gold to evoke autumn forests. These garments were heavy and complex, but wearing them properly was an expected skill, reflecting composure and understanding of aesthetics.
Within this culture of refinement, art was not separate from life. It was life. The way one arranged flowers, folded a letter, or poured tea were all small performances of grace. This created a shared language of gestures and symbols, allowing individuals to express intimacy, defiance, or sorrow without ever needing to speak plainly. A sigh, a pause before replying, the placement of an object, all could be read if one had the education and patience to interpret them. Importantly, this aesthetic discipline was not merely surface level.
It informed ethical values, shaping how individuals viewed restraint, loyalty, and duty. To live beautifully was to live correctly. Excess or clumsiness were not just stylistic errors, they were moral ones. The pressure to maintain this standard could be immense, especially for women, who were expected to embody serenity and refinement in every movement. Yet within these constraints, many found subtle ways to assert agency through subversive poetry, private gardens, or the quiet exclusion of rivals. Some rituals blurred the line between performance and spirituality. The annual purification ceremonies involved wading into cold water or sitting before sacred fires, symbolically casting off the impurities of the past year. These were not dramatic affairs, but solemn, slow, and deliberately choreographed. Even religious devotion had an aesthetic, and the most admired practitioners were those who could blend piety with elegance, creating a presence that was both elevated and approachable. Over time, these rituals became so ingrained in the rhythm of court life that to miss one, even for illness, was to risk becoming irrelevant. But in their repetition lay comfort. Each year brought the same sequence of petals, colors, scents, and sounds, reassuring courtiers that while politics might shift and favor be fleeting, the seasons would return. And within that cycle, they would find their place again, however briefly, in the quiet tapestry of Heian refinement.
What we've just explored is not the history that usually finds its way into bold headlines or dramatic reenactments. There were no grand battles here, no thunderous declarations of war or conquest. Instead, we've traced the quieter threads that held together the world of medieval Japan. Those lived not by shoguns or emperors alone, but by peasants in fields, scribes by candlelight, and courtiers in layered robes. We began in the muddy paddies and trembling silence of the samurai, peasants' world, where hardship was routine and fear was the air they breathed. We followed the trajectory of Miyamoto Musashi, a man shaped by conflict, solitude, and a search for meaning that left behind more than sword techniques. We then descended into the earth, where ancient burial mounds whispered secrets of duty, loss, and carefully hidden treasures. And finally, we drifted through the perfumed halls and still gardens of the Heian court, where beauty was a discipline and every gesture a quiet assertion of grace. Across each of these lives, whether kneeling under the weight of grain tax or penning a poem beneath a cherry tree, the same undercurrent persisted. The tension between the rigid structures of society and the individuals who moved within them. Their stories weren't marked by noise or spectacle, but by repetition, routine, and restraint. That's what makes them enduring. That's what makes them human. In revisiting these moments, not to awaken them, but simply to observe, we can find an odd sort of comfort, not in the suffering or the silence itself, but in the continuity, the knowledge that even in a world so different from our own, the cycles of labor and ritual, of loss and reflection
carried on, and still do in ways we may not always notice. Thank you for taking the time to wander through these hidden corners of history. There is more to tell, but for now, let this quiet journey be enough.